Get started here in another minute. All right, I think we're ready to get started. Hello, everyone. This is the webinar on decarbonization at a district scale about the Colorado Residential Retrofit Energy District project. This is actually our second showing, and apologies to those who tried to join last time. We were having a few technical difficulties, but we're back and excited to share this with you today. I'm Kara Carmichael. I'm a principal at RMI, and I'll be the moderator today. And I've had the pleasure of working with this extraordinary team for the past couple of years on this effort. And we're really excited to share some of our key findings with you today. So I'll go over a few housekeeping items, introduce our speakers, and then turn the floor over to them. As you've probably noticed, this webinar is being recorded. Both the slides and the recording are going to be available to those who have registered once we're done. You are all placed on mute since we're anticipating over 60 folks dialing in today, but just because you're on mute doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. So please send us your questions or thoughts in the chat function at any time during the webinar, and we'll have ample time at the end for some questions and answers. So we have a team of some of the best and the brightest from across the industry from 5 different organizations, and we've been working together, as I mentioned, for several years on this project. And our hope is that this can serve as a scalable model for millions of homes in the US and beyond. And I think that's really what makes this project so exciting for me, is the potential for scale. So we know that to curb climate change and prevent the worst impacts, we need to retrofit 4 million buildings per year. Today, we only we touch about 1 million buildings per year. So this is a 4x increase from our current retrofit rate. And each of those retrofits requires each building to get to 0 carbon. So this is a pretty transformational effort that's going to push on a lot of different fronts. And this effort focuses on scale. And a lot of those buildings that we need to touch are existing single family homes, probably like many of you, like myself, are in our homes today. But we need to really address that sector. And this provides a scalable model to decarbonize at a district or a neighborhood scale. If we go back to the agenda, to share this with you, we'll have some opening remarks from Department of Energy. And then for the bulk of the time, we'll hear from NREL, the NREL team, on what key findings they've extracted from the 2 years of modeling that they've been working on. Then we'll put this into context a little bit more with some input from some of the other project players, the Colorado Energy Office and Xcel Energy, and then we'll close with some Q&A. Next slide, please. So to kick things off, our first speaker is Virginia Castro. Virginia is a project officer for the U.S. Department of Energy State Energy Program, where she manages a portfolio of state and local energy efficiency and renewable energy technology projects, including this one. Our next speaker is from NREL. Lieko Earl is a senior researcher in the Building Technologies and Science Center at NREL. And her current research centers around grid interactive building innovations, including home energy management systems, connected and smart appliances, and electrification strategies. She leads field testing efforts for the residential buildings program and is the NREL lead on this project. Pratik Munankarmi and Jeff McGuire are both researchers at NREL, and they led the energy modeling and analysis efforts for this project, and they'll be here to answer any questions. You'll also hear from other key project partners, including Kim Burke and Jocelyn Durkee from the Colorado Energy Office, and David Potterson from Xcel Energy. So without further ado, thanks again for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Virginia.
Great, thank you so much, Kara. Can you hear me? Excellent.
Yep, we hear you.
Great. So thank you again for inviting me to join all of you today. It's, like Kara, it's been an honor and pleasure to work with the Colorado Energy Office and this fantastic team. So before we get into the featured presentation, I did want to share a little bit of background from a federal perspective as to why DOE, U.S. Department of Energy, specifically the State Energy Program, is committed to supporting states in achieving their climate and energy goals through projects like this. For some context, DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy has the following 5 program priorities listed on the left, which are mainly focused on really decarbonizing our grid across the US. And as a program within EERE's Weatherization and Intergovernmental Programs Office, the State Energy Program provides funding and technical assistance to states, territories, and the District of Columbia to enhance energy security, to advance state-led initiatives, and to increase energy affordability. We, as a program, really emphasize the state's role as the decision maker and administrator for program activities within the state that are tailored to their unique resources, their delivery capacity, and their energy goals. Since 2016, we've provided over $300 million in funding to our grantees through formula grants and competitive awards to fund a range of activities which support various goals, such as increasing the energy efficiency of the US economy, implementing energy security, resilience, and emergency preparedness plans, reducing energy costs and energy waste, increasing the investments to expand the use of energy resources abundant within states, and to promote the overall economic growth with improved environmental quality. The Colorado Energy Office received a competitive award in fiscal year 17 to scope, model, and develop implementation plans for retrofitted residential energy efficiency and renewable energy demonstration project, known as the Colorado Residential Retrofit Energy District, as we call CoRRED. That's what brings us all here today. The team will share more about this project in much greater detail, and I just wanted to share a few slides as to why it's important to test new approaches to demand-side management and EERE integration, and how exploring the existing residential building stock, as Kara had mentioned earlier in this presentation, is so important and to our decarbonization goals. And making these kinds of, doing these kinds of projects allows us to explore new opportunities to provide greater affordability, resilience, and reliability within our communities. I just wanted to share this slide for some context. The slide highlights proportionately the makeup of the US residential sector. There are approximately 120 million US households, half of which are single-family units. The single-family detached unit makes up about 75% of residential energy use. The residential sector accounts for about 21% of the total US consumption. And in 2019, the average household released an estimated 17,000 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions through its energy use. And to put this number into perspective, on an annual basis, the average household is responsible for releasing 70% more CO2 emissions compared to the average passenger vehicle. And of the energy used in US homes, about 50% is accounted for in heating and cooling. In 2017, DOE commissioned a study with EPRI to publish state-level energy efficiency potential estimates. And this map illustrates the total economic electricity savings potential for the US by 2035. The total, and another result from the study showed that the total electricity savings potential from energy efficiency alone is about 740 million gigawatt hours, which is equal to reducing the nation's electricity need by 16%. This analysis was completed using various levels of direct impact and incentives, as well as potential opportunities to increase energy efficiency through cost reductions. The state allocations show that every state has a large amount of electric energy efficiency potential that can be utilized as a cost-effective energy resource. And as you can see, there's a lot of work for us to do, and it is through unlocking energy efficiency potentials, integrating distributed energy resources, and optimizing our building to grid efficiencies, and most of all, and most importantly, partnering with our states and local governments to do projects like CoRRED that will be able to achieve our collective climate and energy goals, while working toward a cleaner, resilient, and more affordable energy future. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Lieko from NREL. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Virginia. Can you go to the next slide? And the next one. All right, so I'm going to try and give the greatest hits version of the results of our work. There is a ton of stuff to unpack here. And for presentation efficiency, I'm taking point on talking through these slides, but Jeff McGuire and Pratik Munankarmi are the modeling experts on our NREL team here. And they're on the line as well to chime in or to help answer any questions that might come up. Next slide, please. Here's the usual outline. I'll start with a bit of background and objectives, and then I'll describe the analysis approach and modeling framework at a very high level. And then I hope to spend most of the time sharing our results. They're organized according to the impact of various retrofit and electrification strategies on first the utility bills, their load profiles and carbon emissions, and then also the distribution system. And then finally, I have a couple slides on conclusions and future work, which I hope will prompt some interesting discussions. Next slide, please. So Virginia already gave us an overview of the collaboration and the funding opportunity that allowed us to form this team. But I'll just say that the scope of this study was really limited to preliminary research toward designing a retrofit energy district based on computer simulations. It turned out to be super informative, and we learned a ton of interesting things, as you'll see. But the next step is really to demonstrate our findings in the field and tackle these challenges, tackle the challenges that we can't really adequately address through modeling work alone. So we are actively pursuing opportunities to conduct a proper field demonstration. Next slide, please. I wanted to mention a couple other background information. It's probably worth defining what an energy district is, given that it's central to our project objectives and it appears in the name of our collaboration. So in our work, an energy district is a system of grid interactive efficient buildings, or GEBs, that incorporates distributed energy resources, or DERs, energy efficiency technologies, energy storage, and advanced building controls, all for the purpose of optimizing energy load and performance. This project is particularly timely for us in Colorado. Like many other parts of the country, our state has some pretty ambitious climate goals. We plan to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and 90% by 2050 relative to 2005 levels. And Xcel Energy, who's part of the CoRRED collaboration and our state's largest utility, has committed to 80% carbon-free electricity system by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So with these goals right in front of us, we can certainly expect that DERs and flexible buildings are going to be essential ingredients in our carbon neutral future. And we're in a bit of a rush to figure out how this is all going to work. Next slide, please. The central research question that we sought to tackle was instead of choosing between traditional energy efficiency upgrades of existing buildings and integration of photovoltaics and other distributed energy resource technologies, what are the most promising combinations of both conventional energy efficiency retrofits and more advanced DER technologies that provide greater system level benefits? Next slide, please. And NREL's role in this project was to conduct the simulation study using building and grid modeling tools, and to collaborate with this team on developing an experimental plan based on the results. We had two main objectives for the modeling effort. One was to characterize the grid flexibility potential and limitations for a range of retrofit scenarios that include both EE and DERs. And the other was to build and demonstrate a robust co-simulation platform that can accommodate additional technologies and scenario studies, so that the methods that we develop here can be applied to other studies in the future. Next slide, please. And then you can jump to the next. So now I'm going to give you a quick overview of our analysis framework. This is a schematic outline of our modeling tools and framework, and we're not going to go too deep into the weeds, and I'm not an expert on any one of these tools, but I just wanted to describe the overall process that lets us simultaneously look at what's going on inside the buildings and how the community loads impact the distribution system. So the process flows from left to right in the schematic. So the first thing that we need is a neighborhood to create this energy district in. And for this, we use an NREL developed tool called ResStock. We created a synthetic neighborhood of 30 single family homes using typology consistent with the Denver neighborhood we selected. So the goal was not to model the same houses that exist in this Denver community, but to create a statistically representative neighborhood that we can use for our simulation study. Next, we used BOPT to identify retrofit packages for different scenarios. BOPT is an optimization tool that was developed at NREL, and it runs on Energy Plus and allows us to compare the costs and benefits of different measures and find the most cost optimal energy efficiency packages. Then we run these homes through another tool called OCRE, another NREL developed tool, which is a reduced order residential building model that's designed for use in buildings to grid co-simulation. Our home energy management system that we employed, or HEMS, is 4C, which was developed by NREL. This is the brain that can coordinate the operation of connected appliances and DERs within a home while maintaining occupant comfort and preferences, and also meeting the utility grid's needs. The distribution system is modeled using OpenDSS, and a co-simulation platform is Helix. And Helix is what manages the information exchange between the different parts of the co-simulation. So using this process, we explored different retrofit scenarios, including the operational characteristics of the homes and their impact on the distribution system. Next slide, please. So the first step was to come up with a neighborhood. And keep in mind, this is not a field project, this is a modeling project. And so it wasn't practical to collect detailed audit data on actual homes in order to recreate an existing neighborhood. But we chose a method that's actually better suited to produce scenarios that are more broadly applicable to other neighborhoods of similar vintage. What we did was we studied the Denver metro area and looking at census data and also comparing notes with where Xcel Energy had distribution feeder models that they could share with us easily. And we selected the Central Park neighborhood, which is located east of downtown Denver. It's at the former site of the now decommissioned Stapleton International Airport, which used to be Denver's main airport before it closed in 1995. And now that area is the largest residential neighborhood within the city limits of Denver. There are a couple of features of Central Park that make it particularly attractive for this type of study. One is that the majority of the homes here were constructed in the early 2000s, which means that the major equipment like HVAC systems and water heaters in these homes are just about approaching end of life. And this first equipment replacement timing is really special. It's a unique window of opportunity for community retrofit strategy because it might be the only time when the replacement cycle is synchronized across many homes. The other thing is that this is a relatively new neighborhood, only 20 years old roughly. So there's a higher likelihood that the distribution infrastructure could accommodate electrification upgrades. Next slide, please. And this schematic gives an overview of the scenarios that we studied. So starting with the baseline scenario, which is our existing mixed fuel neighborhood inspired by Central Park, obtained from Restock sampling. We selected 3 cases that outline the boundaries of our problem space. So this schematic is color-coded. The green boxes refer to mixed fuel scenarios, and the orange boxes are the electrification scenarios. So on the left, you have the baseline. That's the neighborhood that we're starting with, the existing mixed fuel neighborhood. And over to the right, we have 3 different scenarios, 1, 2, and 3. So scenario 1 is the conventional retrofit flexibility. Using BOPT, we found the cost optimal retrofit package just based on simple payback of conventional energy efficiency upgrades to apply to the entire neighborhood. This scenario assumes that there are no additional DER technologies and no controls. There's no electrification. So this can be seen as kind of a lower limit to show how much load flexibility is possible in a mostly business as usual case. Scenario 2 is what we call efficient electrification. Here we eliminated all the natural gas appliances and electrified each home. Instead of looking for cost optimal retrofit packages, we chose the most energy efficient retrofit measures that minimize the annual kilowatt hours of energy use per home. We looked at this scenario with and without DERs and controls. So those correspond to 2A and 2B, the sub-scenarios that break out to the right side of scenario 2. And then finally, scenario 3 at the bottom is electrification without efficiency. So this is a completely different electrification scenario where we simply replaced all the natural gas equipment with electric counterparts and without any energy efficiency improvements. Load shifting is the only energy management strategy here, and we're buying the least expensive equipment rather than the most efficient. This scenario was analyzed with and without DERs and controls, and also with and without rooftop solar. So these sub-scenarios correspond to 3A, 3B, and 3C. Next slide, please. I have a table here that summarizes the upgrades that were selected for each scenario and sub-scenario, and I'm not going to go through them because it takes too long, but I do want to mention quickly how we selected the retrofit measures. So what we did was we used BOPT, and we ran optimization on a handful of buildings that are likely to produce the most different solution packages, and then we selected a combination of measures to apply to the entire community. The reason is that rather than customizing a cost optimal retrofit package for each individual home, implementing similar packages across all the homes is, it more realistically simulates a district retrofit rollout strategy where you're kind of doing the one size fits most strategy so that you're not picking different measures for different homes. Next slide, please. And then the next, so let's move to the results. So it would take much more time than we have to show you all the results for all the scenarios. So we're going to focus on the most interesting cases to look at, namely the scenarios that implement electrification in different ways. So here we have bar charts that summarize the utility bill impacts of the baseline, scenario 1, and scenario 2 retrofits. As a reminder, scenario 2 is efficient electrification. Those are the 2 on the right-hand side. We are using Xcel Energy's time of use rates in our analysis. I'm showing utility bill impacts, but if I were to show you similar charts for the source energy use, the shapes and trends would be very similar, because in our case, the difference between on and off peak TOU rates is not that huge, and the peak periods are relatively short in duration. So you can almost view these graphs as proxy for energy use trends if you prefer to think of it in terms of energy use. So, okay, so here's what we're looking at. The bars are color-coded by end use, and you can see the legend there. These are averaged across 30 homes, which is why you see, for the mixed fuel cases, you see the space heating and water heating in both electric and gas for the baseline and scenario 1 homes. The black line connecting the dots across the bars represents the net bill. This is useful for looking at scenario 2B in the lower right, where the solar panels offset the bills quite a bit to the point that your monthly bill is less than 0 for roughly half the year. So let's look at scenario 2A. If I were to show you corresponding graphs plotted in energy units, you would actually see that the efficient electrification scenario in 2A actually uses slightly less source energy than even the conventional efficiency retrofit in scenario 1. But on an annual basis, the utility costs to homeowners are nearly identical to the baseline because the higher cost of electric heating in the winter offsets the cooling savings in the summer. So in other words, because the electricity is more expensive per unit energy than natural gas under current rates, a conventional retrofit, which is scenario 1, can save money on monthly utility bills relative to the baseline, while an efficient electrification, scenario 2A, is approximately cost neutral in terms of energy bills. In scenario 2B on the lower right, we add additional DERs, including a home energy management system, the largest PV allowable by the local utility, and I'll explain this in a minute, and a 6 kilowatt-hour home battery. Electric vehicles are also added for 1/3 of the homes in this community. This reflects a high adoption scenario, but not unrealistic. And EVs, it turns out, represent a pretty substantial load with a higher annual energy use than space cooling, despite its implementation in only 10 out of the 30 homes. The battery definitely contributes to energy bill savings because of load shifting. It's able to perform arbitrage, storing charge during the sunny off-peak hours in the midday and discharging during peak periods. And a note about the rooftop PV. So it was sized according to the maximum allowable by Xcel Energy, which is up to 120% of the existing load in the home. And this 120% limit is relative to the energy consumption of the baseline scenario. So the maximum PV size is calculated based on pre-retrofit utility bills. This means that PV sizing calculations don't account for anticipated increases in energy needs due to the acquisition of an electric vehicle or as a result of electrification. So the overall result is that the community is a slight net consumer of electricity annually, even though there are many hours of the year when the community is a net producer. So when you're looking at 2B, the net utility bill change is positive, which means it costs approximately $100 more per household per year compared to the baseline. But this is somewhat misleading, and here's why. The increased cost is entirely attributable to the inclusion of electric vehicles, which is offsetting gasoline that would otherwise need to be purchased by the homeowner. And also remember that there are only 10 homes with EVs and not 30 in this community. So if the bill increases all from EV charging, we can estimate that each EV owning household spends roughly $300 per year on electricity to charge their cars. In comparison, the annual cost estimate to fuel a gas-powered vehicle driven the same number of miles is just over $1,000. So they would actually save money. And equally notably, the homes that don't have EVs would not see their utility bills increase in this scenario. Next slide, please. And so now we are looking at similar figures for scenario 3, which is the electrification without energy efficiency retrofits. And I'll cut to the punchline on this one. The key takeaway from this slide is that electrification without any efficiency results in some pretty high electric bills. Scenario 3A on the bottom left is kind of a non-starter. Without efficiency upgrades and without any other DER tools, you end up with roughly 40% higher bills for the homeowners. In scenario 3B, we include some DERs, including a HEMS, an electric vehicle, and a battery, but no solar panels to help power the electric loads. The addition of EV results in some energy use increase over scenario 3A, making this scenario is the highest energy using scenario in our study. But the HEMS is able to reduce some energy use for heating, cooling, and water heating by using the controls to operate at the edge of the flexibility band for comfort. And the battery is able to perform some energy arbitrage. So this scenario has slightly lower bills than 3A, despite the overall energy use increase. Scenario 3C on the bottom right looks a little bit better. We add PV to these homes, but because PV sizing is determined based on the baseline utility bills, the community is still a net consumer, although the net consumption drops by 60% on an annual basis. There are times of the year when this community can export power, especially during the summer months. And homeowners in this scenario 3C still have utility bills to pay, but they're approximately 60% lower than they would be without PV. Next slide, please. And here's a combined figure that shows the average monthly utility bill across all of the cases, so you can kind of see them side to side. Some of the interesting things that pop out here are, if you look at scenario 2A, which is that dark blue, we see that retrofitting the homes to cost efficiently electrify is nearly cost neutral in terms of utility bills with the baseline. There are higher energy bills in the winter because the heating load is electrified and the air source heat pump has lower performance at colder temperatures. But the bills are much lower during the summer months because those air source heat pumps are higher rated and they can more efficiently cool the homes in the central AC systems that they are replacing, that are included in the baseline. If you look at scenario 2B, which is the light blue, when additional DERs like PV, battery, and HEMS are installed, bills decrease significantly. This is largely due to the solar panels, but the HEMS and the battery also provide savings. And in contrast, you can see that the scenario 3 cases, the maroon and orange bars, are pretty much across the board much more expensive from a utility bill perspective, with the small exception of 3C in the summer months when you have PV producing. Okay, next slide, please. So let's look at the community load profile. So this shows the time series of the community-wide load profile for a few days in the summer. The gray areas indicate peak pricing periods. So this is a week or 5 days in July. In scenarios where a HEMS is installed, you can see that there's a large spike ahead of the peak period when the HEMS preconditions the space and preheats the water before the gray peak period. The spike is most notable in scenario 3, where the electric resistance water heaters produce a much bigger load than the heat pump water heater alternative that's used in scenario 2. And the impact of PV becomes immediately apparent. So if you look at scenarios 2B and 3C, the community is a net producer during the summer months, and they output twice as much power as it would otherwise consume during peak periods. Next slide, please. And I have a similar slide here on several days in the winter. In the winter, you basically see similar spikes and valleys, so the PV production is not as robust or reliable as in the summer. And naturally, with electrification, you end up in a winter peaking situation. So you can see that the overall load in the wintertime is much higher than the baseline in electrified scenarios because of the electric heating and the water heating loads. Next slide, please. We also looked at the impact of these scenarios on carbon emissions, and we used watt time grid marginal carbon emissions data to do that. So this figure compares the community-wide carbon emissions calculated for each of the scenarios. Scenario 2B is the lowest carbon emitter in any given month, in stark contrast to 3A and 3B, which are consistently the highest emitters. And it's important to note the variability in emissions levels across different scenarios in our case is largely attributable to differences in equipment efficiencies and whether or not we have solar panels rather than the timing of the load. Because based on our watt time data, the emissions rate is actually relatively flat over time in this region. So the total amount of energy used is really the dominant driver of emissions. Scenario 2B combines efficient electrification with PV generation. So the upshot here is that for the 2B, the carbon impact of 2B is much less than that of 3A and 3B, which employ inefficient electrification strategies and no PV. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm switching over from energy impacts to sort of distribution system. I have a couple quick slides on the distribution system impacts. These graphs show the voltage distribution of each house. So along the x-axis are the houses labeled N1 through N30. And the ANSI standard range for distribution system voltage is between 0.95 and 1.05 per unit. And these limits are shown by the horizontal red lines. This is important to look at because frequent under voltage or over voltage can cause equipment to overheat or degrade in performance and reliability. So I'm just showing 3 of the scenarios here to sort of highlight the differences. The box plot shows the distribution of the voltage profile, where the box, and I apologize, they're a little bit hard to see, but the box in the middle represents the interquartile range. And there's a thin green line, right, kind of somewhere within that box that represents the median voltage. The black circles represent the outliers in that voltage distribution. So in the baseline case, we can see that the voltage profile for most houses, except for N3 and N4, are always within the acceptable limits. Both N3 and N4, it turns out, are located at the end of the distribution feeder, which is contributing to higher voltage drop in the distribution lines. If you look at scenario 3A, as we electrify the HVAC and the water heater, the electricity consumption increases and lowers the voltage profile compared to the baseline scenario. There are many more instances of undervoltage in scenario 3A that we could clearly see compared to the baseline scenario. Now, if you look over at scenario 2B on the right-hand side, the addition of PV is responsible for the instances of higher house voltages, mainly during periods of PV production, but the overvoltage is still within the permissible limits of 1.05 for all the homes. Okay, next slide, please. And here's a slide on transformer loading. So the transformer loading is essentially a ratio of the demand kVA over the transformer capacity. In scenario 3, so this is all the scenarios plotted on one figure. In the scenario 3 cases, we see that the average transformer loading increased by 80 to 92% compared to the baseline. And there are numerous instances where the transformer is significantly overloaded in these scenarios. The loading is much lower in all scenario 2 cases compared to scenario 3 because of the use of more efficient appliances. And I should also note that in our distribution system model, comparatively fewer residential customers are connected to each transformer with respect to its capacity. And this situation is typically only found in newer distribution systems. So it's notable that we're seeing loading increase despite the higher per customer transformer capacity that we have in our situation. This kind of overloading can adversely affect the life of a transformer, so it's really important to do an in-depth study of the distribution system impacts before you embark on electrifying a residential community. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to move to a couple of conclusion slides. So here's some high-level summary bullets. I think we learned that electrification can be achieved without negatively impacting the monthly utility bills. We saw that combining efficiency measures and DERs results in lower energy use, lower carbon emissions, and lower energy bills. We also learned that electrification of a neighborhood definitely increases the system load and creates some stress. So planning for the distribution system is crucial for any efforts to electrify. In this work, we demonstrated an analysis framework that can be applied to community scale beneficial electrification studies in other regions and climates and utility infrastructures and building typologies. And we feel good that the techniques that we developed through our work here, we can use them to make specific targeted recommendations based on quantified projections of energy demand in any given community. Our approach of creating the synthetic neighborhood, so the model neighborhood based on Central Park, is well suited to produce scenario studies that can be applied to other neighborhoods of similar vintage. But in order to obtain more detailed and nuanced results that really realistically predict electrification scenarios, we really need to model the actual buildings and the electrical infrastructure that serves those buildings. So that is precisely how we would begin a future field demonstration. Next slide. This is the last slide. We have some interesting unresolved puzzles that we continue to work on and that can prompt some food for thought. So one is that we saw that efficient electrification alone can result in energy bill savings, but these savings only tell part of the story because the upgrades require upfront costs, and the modest utility bill savings result in long payback periods that are not really appealing or practical to most homeowners. Adding DERs, especially solar panels, as part of electrification produces much bigger savings than efficient electrification without DERs, but we have to figure out how to make these technologies affordable. The other thing is this issue of PV sizing. So the practice of sizing PV systems based on a home's past energy bills, where the maximum allowable is determined to be equivalent to 120% of the home's energy use profile in the previous year, definitely emerged as an issue that's worth consideration. When a home undergoes electrification or buys an electric vehicle, there's a huge increase in electric load. And so it would seem prudent to modify the policy somehow so that homeowners can match the size of their PV installations to future anticipated load. For peak load management, while electrifying a neighborhood increases the maximum load, batteries and PV can reduce summertime peak load to the point the community can be a net producer during peak periods, as long as the surrounding communities are not yet electrified. But looking forward, if the broader system transitions along with this neighborhood, then the entire distribution system could be faced with winter peaks that occur primarily in the early mornings. And if these peaks occur in the early mornings, then solar panels wouldn't be able to shift the load in a meaningful way. So this type of scenario would have implications for the relative value of different DER technologies and their implementation. And we definitely want to explore how load management should be optimized to accommodate wide-scale winter peaks through some clever combination of generation, storage, and efficient end-use equipment. And finally, in our simulations, the HEMS algorithm based its control decisions on occupant comfort and the cost of energy to the homeowner. In other words, the utility bills under TOU rates. But it would be worthwhile to explore how prioritizing other benefits like carbon emissions reduction might alter the overall load profile of a home and the impact of such a change on other benefits. This would be particularly interesting, we think, for regions of the country where the carbon emissions rate varies more dramatically over time. And so optimizing for emissions reduction wouldn't necessarily produce the same results as minimizing energy use or energy cost. And I think that's a wrap for our slides. So I will turn it back over to Kara.
Great, thank you, Lieko. That was a whole wealth of information, and I'm so excited to hear that we can actually electrify our communities without negatively impacting the utility bills for the individual customers. I think that's a huge takeaway from this analysis, and no surprise, if we do it in a smart and efficient way, we can also minimize distribution system impacts. So thank you for that. I kind of wanted to get a little bit more context and hear from some of the other panelists and players involved on how these results impact the mission of your organization, agency, or utility. So Jocelyn and Kim from the Colorado Energy Office, if I could ask to start with you. From the perspective of a state energy office, how does this project support your mission? Jocelyn, maybe you can chime in first.
Yes, thank you, Kara. This is Jocelyn Durkay with the Colorado Energy Office, and Kim will speak to this as well, but one of the interests of our office was to take an integrated planning approach to a whole home DER installation. So that's inclusive of energy efficiency, electrification, distributed generation, and controls, as was mentioned, and also had a keen interest in maintaining and increasing affordability of these retrofits. Currently, as a state and with utility policy, Colorado engages in separate planning processes to really look at these technologies. And so customers are required to navigate different programs and processes to install these measures. And as we discussed earlier, this project attempts to integrate these technologies and programs for homeowners, but also from the perspective of implementers and policymakers too. So I'll let Kim build on this as well.
Thanks, Jocelyn. In addition to what she said, our office was really interested in this project because we see deploying DERs and electrification in existing homes, as Kara and Virginia mentioned, as one of the biggest hurdles to decarbonizing buildings and reaching our emissions reduction goals. We know that few, if any, of these types of projects have been successfully deployed at scale and replicated anywhere. And so through this modeling project, and eventually in our future demonstration, which we're really eager to do, we want to develop an innovative business model to overcome the cost challenges and find solutions to retrofitting the diversity and complexity of homes and technologies, all while generating benefits in terms of energy and cost savings for customers and improved health and environmental outcomes.
Great, thank you. David, from the perspective of Xcel Energy, how does this work support Xcel's mission?
Sure. So, we're going to be winter peaking at some point as we electrify heating loads. It's going to be gargantuanly expensive to build. Generation is expensive to build. So if you don't do it carefully, and if you do it uncontrolled, then generation, transmission, distribution, all those upgrades, they will cost our customers money, right? That all gets baked into our electricity rates. So doing it intelligently can reduce the cost of all that. We could reduce the upgrades that we need to do and keep the cost of electricity low. So that's, literally two of our primary goals are lead the clean energy transition and keep customers' bills low. So in order to do that, we have to do it intelligently and coordinate well.
Great. We need a lot more solutions like this across the state,
yeah,
in order to get there. Yeah.
That we do.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So for those folks joining us, please feel free to add your questions or comments or thoughts into the chat functions we can all see. And maybe I'll just go there first for our to open up the Q&A portion. And I see a couple of questions really around transformer impact, and maybe to combine a few. And Lieko, Jeff, Pratik, I think this is for you guys. But first off, what is the impact on transformer overload? How many minutes, hours of the year were the transformers overloaded? Where do utilities draw the line for too much distribution impact? And then maybe we can follow up with what can we do about that?
Pratik, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. We actually had not calculated the exact minutes or hours of the years that were overloaded, but it's just in terms of magnitude. It was in the scenario 3 where we are just electrifying the buildings without the conventional EE. It actually increased from 80 to 92%. The maximum loads increased from the 80 to 90% at a certain time of the day, of a certain time of the year, though. But yeah, it's interesting in the sense that we definitely need to do the distribution system planning while doing the electrification study. So those two goes hand in hand.
Yeah, completely agree. Can discharging the batteries or shifting other energy demand in the home can we strategically time that to reduce transformer impact? Pratik?
Yeah, so we could do that in the sense, so right now it's in the TOU rates. If every homeowners had the same rates they were exposed to, and then they had the resources such as batteries and shifting of the energy demand, they probably would try to shift the loads away from the high peak price period and then just shift the loads to where the price is low. So that probably would have like a synchronization effect if every homeowner is actually subjected to the same prices. So we could basically try to schedule the TOU rates such that it does not coincide with the high price does not coincide with the peak of the system. Then probably this, the batteries and the shifting would actually help the overall system.
Great. Kind of continuing on that thought. I don't know if we went down at the specific Central Park neighborhood level enough to answer this, but are the current Excel transformers in this area large enough to handle the increased load with scenario 3? Or we need to change them out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we had a discussion with the Excel team on the transformer sizes. So the Central Park area is relatively newer built area in terms of distribution system. So when we're looking at the KVA per customer, the Central Park neighborhood actually was one of the neighborhood where the KVA per customers was high. It was around about like 7 KVA dedicated to each customers, which is higher compared to somewhere around Denver downtown. So we believe that it's at the current moment, it should be able to handle it better than compared to the rest of the feeder in the Colorado region.
Great, thanks. Another question on kind of our modeling assumptions. Well, most of the HVAC systems that this team commissions they underperform as they're installed. And maybe without going into great detail on the specific modeling parameters, do you guys have general thoughts on the differences between our installed operating assumptions that were included in the model versus kind of the actual operating conditions? And we can always follow up with additional specifics as needed. But any general thoughts?
Jeff, I think this is you.
Yeah, I was just going to weigh in. So the way that our HVAC is modeled is sized according to Manual J and assuming correct installation. So there aren't any installation defects that might degrade the performance of the HVAC. So in some ways, that's a best case of that you have contractors who know exactly what they're doing and do everything correctly, and everything is installed great and it performs as expected. But there are definitely, installation isn't always perfect. And so that's a good caveat on the results.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. What would be some of the top efficiency, distributed energy resources, storage, and control strategies to address winter peaking issues with forthcoming future electrification?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, I think it's all of the above strategies that can help us with these early morning, coldest hours of the day when the heat pump is working. To what extent can we rely on batteries? Some of that probably depends on the future cost of home batteries, right? I don't know. I think this is a for everyone kind of question to pontificate.
I will say that winter peaks are very different from summer peaks. So a summer peak is relatively easy to manage. It's a relatively consistent few hours a day, 4 to 6 hours a day. A winter peak, the polar vortex, that lasted multiple days. So winter peaks are harder. I don't know if we have a great solution for it. There was someone's question here was using batteries from electric vehicles instead of a home battery. I think that's a great, a car battery being whatever it is, 100 kilowatt hours, that could be, 3 days worth of power for a home. So there's potential there. I think that is the $1 million question though, how to deal with these winter peaks. I don't think there is any short, good answer for it.
Yep. One question was on if there was any information shared with the resident to inform them of real-time consumption and production. And I guess I would just add that this was a study, and in phase 2, when we actually hope to implement it on an actual neighborhood, there is a whole communications plan designed to really communicate effectively with homeowners. LEACO team, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
There were no residents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. How and when can we find out more about this study?
This particular, the work that we just presented, we are actively working on hopefully getting a paper out. And then after that, some version of a technical report we should be able to make publicly available. If anyone has any follow-up questions, you're welcome to get in touch with us, and we'd love to talk to you more about it.
Great. We got another question on incentives, and I think this is, at the heart of the next steps that you mentioned, LEACO, first costs. So how can we reduce the first costs for these DERs and electrification and solar and storage? And maybe specifically incentives for larger EV battery capacity, what's needed to get EV buyers and manufacturers to upsize EV batteries? I don't know, David, if you have thoughts on this, or LEACO.
I'm not an EV person, so it's not my area of expertise. We did launch an entire transportation electric plan. We're investing heavily in electrified transport. We have a lot of rebates, a lot of programs available. I can't speak to some of the specifics, but I don't know if that's going to answer the question anyway. Yeah, I have no good sort of short answer to that question, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I guess I'm wondering, the context of the question is around increasing the EV battery capacity in the service of hopefully then using that battery as energy storage for the home, or the idea that the range anxiety might still be preventing homeowners from switching over. I'm kind of guessing it's the former, since there were some discussions earlier about kind of using, and I guess it would make sense because if you're relying on your EV battery, you also want to make sure that you can go to work in the morning, right? So maybe that's the gist of the question.
And so it's also a double-edged sword, because the battery is the most expensive part of the car. So in order to get EVs adopted and into customers' home, obviously they want to keep costs as low as possible. I mean, battery technology is a huge, I know everybody's working on better, cheaper batteries, so maybe something cool will come out in the future. But at the moment, I think it's very much a double-edged sword. And we haven't, I could say, even though we have a full transportation electric plan, I don't think the vehicle to home integration, that does exist, but that's very nascent. So I think we definitely need to do a little bit more pilots, field tests on that, on using an EV battery as home backup. That's a relatively complicated situation. I think it holds a lot of potential in the future, but at the moment, that technology is very nascent.
great. I know that we're coming up against, we are at the top of our hour. Virginia, if you could advance one more slide, you have contact information for all of us who are a key part of the projects. Feel free to reach out with additional questions. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you team for all the hard work put into this project. It's really exciting. Thanks everyone.